If you ever loved me, Rowan, do not ask me to bleed for a throne that was never meant for me. Before we begin this emotional journey, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave your thoughts in the comments below to support the channel. Part 1. The high vaulted arches of Blood Moon Hall echoed with frantic cheers, but to Caleb Moore, the thunderous applause sounded like soft glass shattering underground. Standing near the back wall where quiet Omegas were expected to stay unseen, Caleb adjusted his long wool coat to hide his trembling hands. Beneath his left sleeve, a thin white bandage was wrapped around his wrist, covering a shallow mark that still pulsed with an aching warmth. Last night, while the entire pack slept through the bitter winter storm, Caleb had walked the freezing borders alone. With a faint lantern in one hand and a medical kit in the other, he had pressed his own bare skin to the ancient scent stones until their fading blue magic stabilized. He had bled his energy into the soil to protect the northern cabins, to keep the pack's children warm, and to grant Rowan one more peaceful morning before the solemn duties of leadership swallowed him whole. Now, barely 12 feet away, Rowan Blackwell stood at the ceremonial altar. Broad-shouldered, imposing, and clad in a dark ceremonial coat with silver crests, Rowan looked every inch the powerful alpha he was born to be. His jaw was set with unyielding authority as he lifted the silver Luna crown, a crown that Caleb had spent 3 hours polishing that very morning until its filigree gleamed beneath the grand chandeliers. Rowan raised his deep voice, causing the hall to fall into an expectant hush. "Meredith Hale will stand beside me as Luna of the Blackwell pack." A wave of approval erupted across the crowded room. Smiling elders nodded to one another, whispering about how perfect the match was, how strong the line would remain, and how radiant Meredith looked in her white satin gown. Meredith stepped forward, her blonde waves catching the candlelight, her hands trembling with excitement as Rowan carefully placed the silver crown upon her head. Caleb lowered his gaze to his own boots. His throat burned with a dry, suffocating ache. He remembered yesterday evening, when those exact same hands had stitched a loose seam on Rowan's formal jacket, because Rowan hated the feeling of pulled fabric across his shoulders. He remembered leaving fresh chamomile tea outside Rowan's office door, knowing the alpha suffered from silent headaches before public speeches. He remembered the faint, secret wooden ring tucked inside his coat pocket, a simple ring Rowan had carved for him 2 winters ago during a snowbound patrol night when political duty felt thousands of miles away. "You make this heavy life feel possible, Caleb," Rowan had whispered in the dark back then, his warm hand covering Caleb's flour-dusted fingers in the old pantry. Caleb had foolishly believed every word. He had believed that being loved in private meant he would eventually be cherished in public. But looking up now, Caleb saw Rowan's stern profile. The alpha never once looked back toward the quiet corner of the hall. His silver eyes remained locked forward, cold and resolute, as though Caleb was nothing more than a shadow painted onto the wall. As the crowd surged forward to offer wine and congratulations to the new Luna, Caleb took one quiet step backward, then another. He slipped into the dark service hallway before anyone noticed his absence. He walked down the narrow corridors of the pack house, past the laundry room where a basket of damp linens waited for his touch, and past the rows of small boots outside the children's dormitory. Little Mason's boots were on the wrong feet again, left tucked into right, just like always. Caleb reflexively reached down to fix them, but his fingers hovered an inch above the leather before pulling back. He closed his eyes, swallowed the humiliation rising in his throat, and whispered a quiet farewell to the hall that had been his only home for 7 years. He returned to the small staff kitchen, cleaned Rowan's untouched teacup, and packed a small canvas bag with 2 plain shirts, a half-empty bottle of medicine for his sister Nora, and a small leather notebook. On the desk in Rowan's private study, Caleb set down the carved wooden ring. As the first cold gray line of dawn touched the pine trees, Caleb opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the biting morning air, leaving the Blackwell pack behind without looking back. End of Part 1. Part 2. The Cold Trace. The morning air outside the pack house felt like a slap against Caleb's feverish face, sharp and biting. He pulled the collar of his coat tight around his throat, holding his canvas bag close to his ribs. Every step along the frozen gravel path felt heavier than the last, but he refused to slow down. 50 yards ahead, the boundary gate's primary scent stone glowed weakly, its light flickering under a thin coat of morning frost like a dying pulse. Caleb paused by the stone. Instinct, the deep, selfless habit that had defined his 7 years in Blackwell, nearly made him reach out to bleed into the magic once more. He looked down at his left wrist. The white bandage was already stained dark red around the edges, the skin beneath raw and exhausted from being drained over and over. "No more," Caleb whispered into the cold silence. He stepped past the perimeter marker. For the first time in his life, no patrol guard called out his name, no elder questioned his path, and no alpha bond pulled him back with authority. The silence was deafening. He walked down the winding access road until the towering silhouette of Blood Moon Hall shrank into a distant, shadowed shape against the gray dawn. When he reached the crooked metal bus stop at the edge of the county road, Caleb sank onto the icy bench. His hand reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen flickered to life, showing an automated pack alert sent to all lower-tier staff. Boundary fluctuation detected in northern sector. Report to Luna office immediately. Caleb let out a short, hollow laugh. "Too late," he murmured to the empty trees. "Find someone else to bleed for your walls." Back at the pack house, the first person to realize Caleb was missing was not Rowan, nor the elders, but 7-year-old Mason. The young boy stood barefoot at the top of the kitchen stairs, clutching a stuffed bear, looking for the warm cup of milk Caleb always prepared after bad dreams. The kitchen was pitch black. The kettle was cold, the counter was empty, and the soft, comforting scent of rain and lavender that usually filled the lower floor had completely vanished. Upstairs, Rowan woke with a sharp, suffocating coldness spreading through his chest. He sat up abruptly in his bed, pressing a hand over his heart as though trying to physically catch a thread that had just snapped. He looked toward his desk across the bedroom. Sitting squarely in the center of the dark oak surface was the small wooden ring he had carved 2 winters ago. Rowan crossed the room in 3 quick strides. He picked up the piece of carved wood, his thumb tracing the rough, hand-sanded edges. Memories hit him like a physical blow. The blizzard outside the remote patrol cabin, Caleb's quiet laugh when the ring turned out slightly too small, and the absolute, unwavering trust in Caleb's soft gray-blue eyes. "It is not a formal promise," Rowan had lied back then, bound by his father's strict expectations of what an alpha's mate should be. "Then I won't ask it to be," Caleb had replied softly, accepting the secrecy without a single murmur of complaint. A quick knock sounded at the door, and Meredith stepped into the study. She wore a tailored velvet dress chosen by the elders for her first morning as Luna. She looked elegant, but her eyes were wide with sudden anxiety. "Rowan," Meredith said, her voice strained. "The northern ridge scentstones just went dark. The council is waiting in the main hall. Why isn't the boundary stabilizing?" Rowan didn't answer right away. His fingers tightened around the wooden ring until the edges bit into his skin. Meredith's eyes dropped to his hand, then to the empty hallway outside. "Where is Caleb?" she asked quietly. "He's gone," Rowan said, his voice terrifyingly flat. Before Meredith could process the words, Rowan pushed past her and marched down the west corridor to Caleb's small room beside the linen closet. He threw the door open. The room was immaculately tidy. The small narrow bed was made with military precision, the sheets pulled tight. On the small wooden bedside table sat a neat stack of sealed envelopes, written in Caleb's careful handwriting. For Mrs. Bell. For Peter. For Mason. For Rowan. Rowan tore open his envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper. There were no harsh insults, no angry demands, and no dramatic goodbyes. It was simply a list. 1. Mrs. Bell needs her tea with honey when her hands shake in the morning. 2. Mason gets scared of thunder. Keep his blue cup on the lower shelf. 3. The south pantry window leaks when it rains hard. 4. Do not let the elders make Meredith carry the pack work alone. At the very bottom, beneath a line that had been written and scratched out twice, Caleb had added one final sentence. "I was tired, Rowan. And you looked right through me." A sudden wave of panic, raw and unadulterated, washed over Rowan Blackwell. The proud alpha who had never lost his composure in front of elders or rival packs suddenly felt the floor dropping beneath his feet. He sprinted out of the room, down the main staircase, and out into the freezing fog, chasing the faint, fading scent of rain and lavender down the lonely country road. End of Part 2. Part 3. A Shadow on the Road. The cold bench at the county bus stop cut through Caleb's trousers, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the quiet hollow expanding in his chest. He clutched his small canvas bag against his ribs, staring down at the cracked asphalt where patchy fog rolled across the road. The automated pack alert on his phone screen faded to black, leaving him in total silence. Behind him, the pine branches rustled. Caleb froze, his breath catching in his throat. A tall figure stepped out from the thick mist near the drainage ditch. He wore a dark canvas jacket with a silver crest from the neighboring district, carrying a heavy steel toolbox in one hand and a steaming paper coffee cup in the other. He had sandy blonde hair, flat on one side as if he had just woken up in the back of a truck, and calm, tired hazel eyes. His scent marked him clearly as an alpha, but unlike Rowan's overwhelming, suffocating dominance, this man's aura was steady, quiet and low, like a hearth fire left to glow softly in the dark. The stranger stopped a deliberate 10 feet away, giving Caleb plenty of space. His eyes flicked down to Caleb's bloody sleeve, then toward the dark ridge where the scent stones had failed, before returning to Caleb's pale face. "Morning," the man said, his voice deep and smooth. "Bad time to ask if you're the reason half the northern border just sighed like a broken generator?" Caleb blinked, taken aback by the absurdity of the question. I'm sorry. Elias Grant," the man said, lifting his coffee cup slightly in greeting. Border clinic doctor, part-time mechanic, and apparently full-time witness to people making life-altering choices before sunrise. He gestured toward Caleb's left arm. "You're bleeding through your coat, sweetheart." Caleb immediately pulled his arm closer to his chest, his posture defensive. "I'm fine." Elias didn't take a step closer. He simply stood his ground, observing Caleb with quiet respect. That's usually what people say right before they pass out on the gravel. For the record, I prefer doing paperwork after I've had breakfast. Caleb opened his mouth to tell the stranger to mind his own business, but the world suddenly tilted beneath his boots. The blood loss from the past 3 days of maintaining the pack's wards, combined with the emotional exhaustion of the ceremony, finally caught up to him. He swayed, his fingers slipping from the strap of his bag. Before he could hit the ground, Elias set his coffee on the bench and stepped forward. Not grabbing Caleb aggressively, but holding out steady hands to catch him by the shoulders before easing him down onto the wooden seat. "Easy," Elias murmured gently, his hands retreating the moment Caleb stabilized. "I won't touch you without permission. But that wrist needs fresh gauze before you get on any bus. Can you fix it?" Caleb whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "I can clean it," Elias corrected softly, crouching down in the gravel and opening his black medical kit. "Hold out your arm." Caleb hesitantly extended his left arm. Elias worked with quick, practiced precision, unwinding the crude bandage Caleb had wrapped earlier. As the raw, magical burn on Caleb's skin was revealed, Elias's relaxed expression tightened. His hazel eyes sharpened with professional outrage. "This isn't an injury from a fight or an accident," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. "Someone has been using your personal bond channels to force power into failing boundary stones. That's illegal under regional pack law. It drains the spirit." "It kept the children safe," Caleb said quietly, staring at his shoes. "It almost killed you," Elias countered flatly, applying a soothing antiseptic salve that immediately stopped the burning sensation. "Whoever let you do this belongs in a cell, not a throne room." Before Caleb could answer, the roar of a high-powered engine shattered the quiet morning. Headlights cut through the thick fog as a sleek black pack SUV pulled up to the roadside, its tires screeching to a halt on the loose gravel. The driver's door slammed open. Rowan Blackwell stepped out into the misty dawn, his hair disheveled, his dark ceremonial coat unbuttoned, and his silver eyes wide with raw desperation. In his right hand, he still clutched the small wooden ring Caleb had left on his desk. Rowan's eyes locked onto Caleb sitting on the bench, then immediately dropped to Elias crouching beside him, touching Caleb's wrist. An explosive, protective alpha growl echoed from Rowan's chest, turning the surrounding air heavy and charged with dangerous pressure. "Get your hands off him," Rowan commanded, his voice rumbling like distant thunder as he took a heavy step forward. Elias didn't flinch. He slowly stood up, placing his broad frame casually between Rowan and Caleb. He didn't bare his teeth or release an aggressive scent. He simply stood there like an unyielding brick wall. "And you must be the reason this boy looks like he hasn't slept in a month," Elias said calmly, tossing his used gloves into his kit. "You're trespassing on public county land, Alpha Blackwell." Rowan ignored Elias, his frantic gaze fixing entirely on Caleb. The terrifying anger in Rowan's face crumbled into something pitiful and broken, as he saw the blood on Caleb's sleeve and the exhaustion in his pale face. "Caleb!" Rowan choked out, his voice trembling as he held up the wooden ring. "Please. Look at me. Tell me what they did to you." Caleb sat on the cold bench, looking at the man he had loved in secret for years. The Alpha who had crowned another Luna just hours ago was now standing in the dirt begging. But inside Caleb's chest, the golden thread that had once bound him to Rowan felt cold, dead, and entirely broken. End of Part 3. Part 4. The Unspoken Truth. The low hum of the SUV's engine idle cut through the heavy silence of the foggy roadside. Rowan stood frozen near the driver's door, the carved wooden ring pressed so tightly in his palm that his knuckles turned white. His ceremonial coat was still crooked at the shoulder, a small detail Caleb usually fixed before any public ceremony. Caleb stared at that twisted seam. The familiar deep-rooted urge to step forward, smooth the fabric, and make Rowan look whole again rose in his chest out of habit. But as his left wrist throbbed beneath Elias's fresh bandage, Caleb held his arm close and stayed behind Elias's broad shoulder. Rowan saw that subtle movement, the way Caleb intentionally placed another man between them, and his breath hitched. "Caleb," Rowan repeated, his voice dropping into a desperate whisper. "Tell me what happened. You left without a word. The elders said." "You were right there, Rowan," Caleb interrupted softly. His voice didn't carry anger or spite. It held only the terrifying weight of complete emotional detachment. Elias bent down, picked up his coffee cup from the gravel, and took a slow sip. "I'm going to stand right here and pretend this dark roast is the most interesting thing in the county," Elias remarked dryly. "Nobody forced me to do emotional security work before 6 in the morning." The absurdly mundane comment broke the suffocating pressure in the air. Caleb felt the corner of his mouth twitch in a near-invisible smile. Rowan caught that tiny reaction, and a flare of bitter pain flashed across his silver eyes. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Caleb was finding comfort in a complete stranger, while standing cold and wounded right in front of him. "When my parents died 7 years ago," Caleb said, his gaze drifting past Rowan toward the dark outline of the pine trees. "Your father let Nora and me stay at Blackwell because my mother had served the pack for 20 years. I was 15. Nora was 7 and had asthma so severe she had to sleep sitting up." Rowan took half a step forward, his voice tight. "Caleb, you were family." "I was a charity case," Caleb corrected flatly. "I learned very quickly that if I was quiet, useful, and kept my head down, no one would remind us that we didn't belong. So when Elder Marlowe came to me 3 years ago, and told me my bond was just useful enough to patch the boundary stones until a real Luna arrived, I agreed. He promised Nora's medical funds would be safe as long as I kept the stones alive." Rowan's posture shattered. His eyes widened in absolute shock. "Marlowe threatened Nora's care? He forced you to drain your life force." "He didn't have to threaten," Caleb replied, looking down at his worn leather boots. "That's the power elders have. They can ruin your life with a polite smile while handing you a cup of tea." "Why didn't you tell me?" Rowan demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and grief. "I would have stopped him. I would have torn the council apart." Caleb finally met Rowan's eyes, locking his pale gray-blue gaze onto the Alpha's silver ones. "I tried, Rowan. 3 times. Rowan went entirely still. "Once in the pantry when you were late for a council meeting," Caleb counted quietly. "Once after Nora's fever broke and I asked if we could talk in private. And once last winter in your office, when I told you the stones were burning my skin." The fog shifted around them. Rowan's face drained of all color as memories crashed over him. The warm fireplace in his office, the snow beating against the glass, and Caleb standing near the desk, pale and hesitant. Rowan remembered pulling his heavy wool coat off his shoulders, wrapping it around Caleb, kissing his forehead tenderly, and telling him he was just worrying too much about pack stress. "I thought I was protecting you," Rowan choked out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I thought keeping you out of pack politics was keeping you safe." "No," Caleb said gently, striking the final blow to Rowan's pride. "You were protecting yourself from having to choose an omega over your title." Before Rowan could speak, the loud squeal of old brakes echoed down the road. The Orange County bus lumbered out of the mist, stopping right beside the bench with a heavy hiss of air. The doors folded open, and the tired driver peered out at the three men. "Anyone getting on?" the driver asked, looking between Rowan's expensive suit and Elias's toolbox. "Or is this a family drama I shouldn't be watching?" Elias murmured under his breath. America's public transit, arriving late and emotionally inconvenient. Rowan looked at the open bus doors, then at Caleb's small canvas bag, and finally at Caleb's exhausted face. For the first time in his life, the commanding alpha did not give an order. He slowly stepped back, leaving the path clear. "I won't force you," Rowan whispered, his voice trembling violently. "I won't lock you in a cage, Caleb." Suddenly, the black SUV's dashboard radio crackled to life with high-pitched static. Meredith's panicked voice blasted through the speaker. "Rowan, the nursery wards just collapsed completely. The children are screaming. Mason is asking for Caleb." Caleb's body went rigid. The deep-seated instinct to protect the pack's children surged through his veins, urging him to rush back and fix the problem. Beside him, Elias didn't grab him or push him toward the bus. He simply said in a low, grounding tone, "You can care about them, Caleb, without letting them use your kindness as a weapon against you." Caleb closed his eyes, taking a long, shaky breath. When he opened them, the bus doors were waiting. Rowan was standing pale and helpless, and the choice was entirely his. End of Part 4. Part 5. The Unraveling Mask. The bus doors waited, open and hissingly impatient, while Meredith's desperate voice continued to crackle through the SUV's radio speaker. Caleb closed his eyes for 3 long seconds. He thought of Mason's small mismatched boots, the cold room, and the quiet fear in the children's eyes whenever the boundary magic failed. "I am going to the nursery," Caleb said, stepping away from the bus and turning toward Rowan. "After that, I am leaving with Dr. Grant." Rowan's eyes flicked to Elias, his expression instantly hardening into the cold mask of an alpha. "Dr. Grant," Rowan repeated softly, the words dripping with dangerous intent. "This is internal pack business." "No," Caleb said, his voice ringing with a firm strength he had never allowed himself to use before. "It is my body, my bond magic and my life. That makes it my business." They returned to Blood Moon Hall in separate vehicles. Rowan sped ahead in his black SUV, while Caleb sat in the passenger seat of Elias's battered pickup truck. The heater clicked rhythmically, filling the cabin with faint warmth. On the dashboard, a tiny plastic dinosaur was glued next to the radio dial. "My niece put that there," Elias mentioned casually, breaking the quiet without pushing for details. "Said every medical emergency needs a dinosaur supervisor." Caleb's lips curved into a genuine, albeit small, smile. "She sounds remarkably practical." When they pulled up to the pack house, the front driveway was in absolute chaos. Pack members, elders, and guards stood in scattered groups, whispering nervously. As Caleb stepped out of the truck, the crowd fell silent, their gaze shifting between the bloody bandage on his wrist and the unfamiliar alpha walking calmly beside him. Whispers ripple through the crowd like wildfire. He abandoned his post. The new Luna couldn't hold the wards. Did he bring a rogue alpha to challenge the pack? Caleb lowered his head out of instinct, the familiar shame tightening his chest. But before he could sink into his own isolation, Elias adjusted his step, walking directly beside Caleb, not shielding him like a helpless victim, but standing as an unshakable wall of silent support. "Interesting theory," Elias said aloud to no one in particular, his calm voice carrying across the quiet porch. In my experience, quiet people usually hide exhaustion. Loud people usually hide guilt. Several elders flushed red and turned away. Rowan, standing at the top of the porch stairs, watched the interaction with a dark, painful knot in his throat. He realized with brutal clarity that Elias was defending Caleb with an effortless grace that Rowan had failed to show in 7 years. Inside the nursery, the air was freezing. The children were huddled together under heavy quilts, frightened by the failing wards. The moment the door opened, 7-year-old Mason sprinted across the room, slamming into Caleb's legs and wrapping his arms around his waist. "You left!" Mason cried, burying his face in Caleb's coat. "Did we do something bad?" Caleb knelt immediately, using his uninjured hand to lift the boy's chin. "No, Mason. Never. Grown-ups made a mess, but it is not your fault." Across the room, Meredith stood near the window, her hands trembling over the silver Luna collar resting heavy against her throat. She looked pale, exhausted, and completely overwhelmed. "I tried, Caleb," Meredith whispered, her voice breaking. "I tried to feed power into the scent stones, but I couldn't feel them. I couldn't make them work." "Because the bond was never yours to carry," Caleb answered softly, holding no malice toward her. The door swung open again, and Elder Marlowe marched into the room, flanked by 2 senior council members. Marlowe offered a smooth, polished smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Caleb," Marlowe said patronizingly, "there has been a slight misunderstanding. Leaving during a border crisis could be classified as treason, but if you return to your duties quiet and without causing a scene, no formal charges will be made." Rowan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Marlowe, that's enough." "No," Caleb cut in, standing up slowly and looking Elder Marlowe dead in the eye. "Think carefully before you threaten me again, Marlowe." Caleb turned his gaze to Meredith, pointing to the glittering band around her neck. "Take off the collar, Meredith." The entire room went dead silent. "If they want to accuse someone of abandoning a Luna's duty," Caleb stated, his voice steady and echoing clearly off the stone walls, "then first they can explain to the pack why they put the wrong person in chains." End of Part 5. Part 6. The Unraveling. Meredith's fingers rested on the cold metal of the silver Luna collar. Her breathing came fast and shallow as Elder Marlowe stepped forward, his polished facade cracking to reveal a sharp, ugly glare. "Miss Hale, do not listen to him," Marlowe commanded, his authority slicing through the chilled nursery air. "That collar was blessed before the entire pack. Removing it now would be an open insult to the council, the Alpha line, and the sacred traditions that have kept Blackwell safe for generations." Caleb did not raise his voice. He simply shifted his gaze from Marlowe to Rowan, who stood frozen in the doorway. The carved wooden ring was still held in Rowan's tight grip, but his lips remained locked in hesitation. Caleb felt that brief delay like a slow, familiar knife wound. Even now, with the room watching, Rowan was calculating the fallout, balancing council politics, family legacy, and public image against the truth. Meredith saw it too. The illusion of being wanted, of being chosen for who she was, crumbled inside her chest. With trembling hands, she reached behind her neck, clicked the ceremonial clasp open, and pulled the heavy silver band free. The small metallic snap sounded like a thunderclap in the silent room. "I thought being chosen meant I was desired," Meredith whispered, her eyes brimming with tears as she looked directly at Caleb. "I didn't know it meant someone else was being erased." She walked past the stunned elders, carrying the sparkling Luna collar like a piece of dead iron, and placed it down on the small play table beside Mason's green plastic dinosaur. The contrast was stark, a symbol of supreme pack power resting next to a cheap child's toy. Marlowe's face turned deep red. "You foolish girl. Caleb has always possessed a dangerous gift for appearing helpless while creating dependency." He whirled on Rowan. "Alpha, speak to your people. We chose stability. We chose bloodline. We chose a Luna the pack could actually respect." Rowan's silver eyes flared with a dark, terrifying intensity. "Say that again," he growled low, taking a heavy step into the room. "I will say it plainly," Marlowe spat, emboldened by decades of unquestioned authority. The pack needed someone worthy of standing beside you. Not a low-born Omega, who was kept here out of charity. Caleb closed his eyes as the word charity echoed through his head. It was the truth he had feared since he was 15 years old, standing in the pack kitchen with his little sister's medication in his pocket, promising to work until his hands bled, just so they wouldn't be thrown out into the snow. 7 years of scrubbing floors, stitching coats, mending wounds, and bleeding into ancient boundary stones had bought him no real standing. To the council he was never family, he was just an convenient tool. When Caleb opened his eyes, Rowan was staring at him in sheer horror, finally hearing the rotten core of the system he had sworn to protect. Caleb reached down into his canvas bag, pulled out a small brass key, the key to the pack infirmary that he had worn on a cord around his neck for years, and laid it gently beside the silver collar. "I am done proving that I have to bleed to deserve basic human kindness," Caleb said softly. He looked at Rowan one last time. "Keep the ring, Rowan. You were right 2 years ago. It was never a promise." "Caleb, please," Rowan choked out, reaching a hand toward him, but his fingers stopped inches short. Elias opened the nursery door wide, positioning his body to give Caleb a clear, unblocked path into the hallway. "Path is clear, Caleb," Elias said quietly. Caleb walked past Rowan without turning back. As he stepped out into the corridor, Rowan's broken voice drifted after him from behind. "I should have chosen you." Caleb paused for a fraction of a second, his shadow stretching long against the stone wall. "No, Rowan," Caleb answered back. "You should have defended me before choosing became public." End of Part 6. Part 7. The Weight of Silence. The grand oak front doors of Blood Moon Hall did not slam when Caleb walked out into the pale afternoon light. They closed with a soft, devastating finality that echoed through every empty corridor of the sprawling estate. He did not leave through the shadowed cellar exit, or the rear laundry gates he had used for 7 long years to fetch supplies and haul heavy baskets, without disturbing the high-ranking members. This time he walked directly down the central marble staircase with his canvas bag slung over his broad shoulder, his head held straight, and his eyes focused entirely on the open path ahead. Every conversation in the grand foyer died as he passed. Warriors standing guard by the carved pillar posts, high Omegas arranging late afternoon flower arrangements for the post-ceremony banquet, and elderly betas who had known Caleb since he arrived as a frightened 15-year-old orphan all stood entirely frozen. No one stepped forward to block his exit. No one raised a voice in command. No one possessed the words to stop a man who was walking away from his own quiet execution with such haunting composure. Elias followed 3 careful paces behind him. The tall doctor kept a steady distance, ensuring the crowd understood that he was neither dragging Caleb away as a prisoner nor claiming him as property. He stood simply as an unshakable shield at Caleb's back, giving him the space to breathe, without the suffocating weight of the pack pressing against his spine. From the top landing of the curved marble stairs, Rowan watched the faint blue thread of Caleb's aura detach itself completely from the estate walls. Rowan's hands trembled violently inside his coat pockets. The public alpha in him understood that he was surrounded by dozens of witnesses, his council members, his border officers, the frightened children clustered at the nursery hallway, and Meredith standing silently near the lower pillars with the silver Luna collar no longer around her neck. They were waiting for him to issue a stern command, to declare an emergency lockdown, or to unleash his formidable dominant pressure to bring the rebellious Omega back into line. Instead, Rowan could only stare at the frayed seam on Caleb's left sleeve. It was the loose thread Caleb had been meaning to mend for 3 weeks, delayed again and again because he was too busy stitching torn patrol jackets for the border guards and tailoring formal shirts for Rowan's inauguration ceremony. Caleb had fixed everyone else's world, while his own was left to fall apart in silent dark corners. When the heavy front doors finally settled into their frames with a quiet latch, Rowan turned without a word and walked down the west corridor toward Caleb's small room beside the linen closet. He pushed the door open, his chest heaving, his fingers still clutching the cold carved wooden ring so hard the corners cut into his palm. The room smelled faintly of clean cotton, dried lavender and rain. The narrow twin bed was made with military precision, the sheets tucked in rigid, seamless hospital corners, a habit Caleb had picked up during the endless nights he spent sitting beside his sister Nora's hospital bed in the county clinic. On the small wooden desk sat a chipped ceramic mug filled with sharpened pencils, a neatly folded stack of grocery receipts, and an old smartphone with a spiderweb crack across the upper left corner. Rowan approached the desk like a man approaching an altar built for a forgotten god. He reached down with trembling fingers and pressed the power button on the old phone. The screen lit up instantly. There was no password or security lock. Caleb had never believed he owned anything valuable enough to hide from the world. The messaging app was open to Rowan's name. Down the screen stretched a long, heartbreaking row of unsent draft messages, dozens of short, painful notes typed late at night over the course of 3 long years and erased before they could ever reach Rowan's inbox. Rowan, can we talk after the council meeting ends? The stones are getting hotter. Deleted. Rowan, my wrist hurts more when it rains. I think the bond connection is leaking. Deleted. Rowan, I know the pack needs a real Luna from a powerful bloodline, but I just need to know if there was ever a place for me here that wasn't just useful. Deleted. The final draft had been typed at 3:42 a.m. that very morning, just hours before the crown was placed on Meredith's head. Rowan, I am leaving before I start begging you to keep me. Rowan collapsed onto the edge of the narrow mattress, covering his face with his free hand as a ragged, choked sob escaped his throat. The alpha who had faced rogue packs, border wars and political schemes without flinching now sat broken on a cheap foam mattress, surrounded by the quiet evidence of his own cowardice. 7-year-old Mason appeared in the open doorway, holding his blue plastic cup in both small hands. His mismatched boots were fixed properly for the first time in months, the left foot buckled on the left side, the right on the right. Is Caleb angry at us, Alpha Rowan? Mason whispered, his small voice echoing softly off the bare walls. Rowan forced himself to look up at the child. He stripped away every formal title, every posture of dominance, and every lie he had used to justify his choices. No, Mason, Rowan said, his voice raw and gravelly. He isn't angry. He is just tired because we allowed him to carry everything alone. Mason walked into the room with solemn slowness, set the blue cup on the wooden desk beside the chipped pencil mug, and looked up at Rowan. I'll leave it here for when he comes back, the boy said softly before turning away. Downstairs in the grand foyer, Elder Marlowe was standing on the second step, attempting to rally the confused crowd. The Omega is unstable. He has been corrupted by an outside rogue influence. We must maintain order and protect the pack's reputation before rumors spread to rival territories. Meredith stepped out from the shadows near the pillars, her voice ringing clear and steady across the marble hall. No, Marlowe. You want to protect your reputation. Caleb protected our lives. Rowan descended the stairs slowly, his eyes fixed entirely on Elder Marlowe. The atmosphere in the foyer grew icy, charged with an overwhelming alpha pressure that made even the senior guards take an instinctive step back. Elder Marlowe, Rowan said, his tone low and terrifyingly calm. You are relieved of your council duties and stripped of your administrative authority, effective immediately, pending a full criminal investigation into the boundary bond abuses. Marlowe's face turned pale, then dark with outrage. You would disgrace your father's counsel for an Omega who abandoned his post? Rowan opened his hand, letting the entire pack see the tiny plain wooden ring lying flat on his scarred palm. I am disgracing myself, Rowan said loudly enough for every guard, elder and servant to hear. Because I called love private while I allowed your cruelty to become our official policy. Far down the valley road, beyond the border gates, the low rumble of Elias's pickup truck carried Caleb toward the western county line. Caleb sat in the passenger seat, staring into the side mirror as the grand spires of Blood Moon Hall shrank into tiny gray specks amidst the dark pine forest. He waited for a surge of victory or a wave of bitter regret, but all he felt was a quiet, deep, and ordinary fatigue. His wrist still throbbed, his stomach was empty, and the afternoon sun turned the asphalt ahead into a ribbon of pale gold. Elias drove silently for 5 miles before reaching the junction, where the state highway crossed into the neighboring district. He slowed the truck down near the wooden sign marking the county border. The clinic has an apartment on the top floor, Elias said casually, keeping his eyes on the road. It has terrible floral curtains, a radiator that clanks when it warms up, and a toaster that burns only the left side of the bread. Very exclusive. Caleb turned his head, looking at the tired doctor's calm hazel eyes. For the first time in 3 days, a real, unfettered smile touched his lips. It sounds completely awful. It is, Elias replied gently. But nobody up there will ever mistake your exhaustion for duty. End of Part 7. Part 8. The Border of Freedom. 3 months passed over the Western Valley with the quiet, unhurried rhythm of autumn. The leaves along the county line turned deep crimson and gold, dusting the gravel driveway outside the small border clinic where Caleb now lived. His new life was simple, unburdened, and remarkably calm. The small apartment above the clinic had ugly floral curtains and a radiator that clanked loudly in the cold mornings, just as Elias had promised. But for the first time in his life, Caleb woke up without the crushing pressure of a pack bond pulling at his chest. His left wrist had healed, leaving only a faint, silver line where the magic had once burned through his skin. Every morning, Caleb helped Elias organize the clinic's medical supplies, check inventory, and handle simple administrative work. He was paid a fair wage, money that went directly into his own savings account to support his sister Nora, who was now living comfortably in a specialized medical facility 2 towns over. The PAC funds for her care had been legally transferred into her name under the Regional Medical Board supervision, entirely free of council conditions or implicit threats. Back at Blood Moon Hall, the illusion of smooth perfection had completely shattered, forcing a painful but necessary rebuilding. Without Caleb to bleed his energy into the ancient scent stones, Rowan had been forced to hire certified, professional wardens to repair the northern boundary network properly. The council was stripped of its absolute power, and Elder Marlowe was formally banished from Blackwell territory, following an investigation that revealed years of financial and magical exploitation of lower-tier Omegas. Meredith remained at the pack house, though not as Luna. She had firmly refused the title, choosing instead to manage the estate's daily logistical operations as her own person. She took over the nursery schedule, and while she was initially clumsy with bedtime stories and terrible at hiding vegetables in the children's stew, Mason and the other pups grew to love her for her genuine, unscripted honesty. Rowan changed too, though his transformation was marked by a quiet, heavy grief. He no longer sat at the head of long council tables issuing cold directives. He spent his early mornings walking the perimeter paths alone, carrying the small carved wooden ring in his coat pocket like an unpayable debt. He did not search for Caleb, nor did he send guards to track down the pickup truck that had carried his Omega away. He had finally understood the hard lesson Caleb left behind. Coming back could never be demanded. It had to be earned by creating a world where no one was required to disappear just to keep others comfortable. On a chilly Saturday afternoon in late October, a small unmarked parcel arrived at the Blackwell post office addressed directly to Rowan. Inside was a single photograph and a small piece of folded paper. Rowan stood by his office window, the pale autumn sunlight filtering through the glass as he opened the envelope with steady fingers. The photograph showed the porch of the Western Border Clinic. Caleb was standing near the wooden railing in an oversized gray sweater, his brown hair tousled by the wind, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold air. Sitting on the porch rail beside him was Mason's old blue plastic cup, the one Mason had left on Caleb's empty desk months ago, which Elias had quietly mailed back after visiting the local post office. Caleb was holding a warm mug in both hands, looking directly into the camera with a calm, clear expression. He wasn't crying, he wasn't looking back, and he wasn't hiding. On the back of the photograph, in his neat, familiar handwriting, Caleb had written a single line. "I am safe, Rowan. And I am finally learning what peace feels like." Rowan carried the photograph down to the nursery hall. Mason was sitting on the rug with a set of wooden blocks, his boots put on correctly left to left and right to right. When Rowan held out the picture, the little boy looked at Caleb's smiling face, his eyes lighting up with soft relief. "He looks happy," Mason said softly, running his thumb over the edge of the photo. "He does," Rowan replied, his voice thick with emotion as he knelt beside the child. "He really does." That evening, Rowan placed the photograph on the shelf above his office desk, not as a trophy, not as a desperate claim of ownership, but as a constant reminder of the boundary Caleb had drawn for himself, a boundary that Rowan and the entire pack had finally learned to honor. Miles away to the west, the sunset painted the sky in shades of deep amber and lavender. Caleb sat on the clinic porch, wrapped in his heavy jacket, listening to the quiet rustle of the wind through the pines. From inside the kitchen window, he could hear Elias arguing good-naturedly with the one-sided toaster, while the kettle began to whistle on the stove. Caleb lifted his mug, taking a slow sip of hot tea, and looked out over the open road stretching into the horizon. He did not know what the future held, nor did he care to predict it. He only knew that when the morning came now, he no longer had to vanish to be free. End of Part 8. What a journey this story was. We witnessed how choosing yourself and establishing boundaries, even when it's painful, is the ultimate act of self-respect. Caleb's quiet strength reminds us that your worth should never depend on how much of yourself you are willing to burn away for others. If Caleb's journey struck a chord with you today, don't let this story end here. Take a second to smash that like button and hit subscribe with notifications turned on. It directly supports the channel and keeps these powerful BL stories coming your way. Now, I want to hear from you. Which moment hurt you the most? Was it Rowan discovering the unsent text messages, or the exact moment Caleb refused to bleed for a throne that wasn't his? Drop your thoughts down in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for watching, and remember, never shrink yourself just to fit into someone else's world. See you in the next story.